Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chart Chat. We are excited to go ahead and welcome you from around the world to join us for Chart Chat number 36. Number 36. I'm
Woo!
Amanda. I'm Amanda McCulloch. I am the executive director for the Global Data Visualization Society, and joining you from Washington, D.C. I'm excited to welcome our special guest today, Alberto Cairo. Welcome, Alberto. Thanks for
Hi,
joining us
hello
today.
everyone. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled to have you here as part of our Chart Chat stream. Alberto, if you don't know, is the author of 3 books and a forthcoming book that we'll be talking about today as part of our program. And before we dive in and get started, I'd love to give an opportunity for all of my co-hosts to introduce themselves and for Alberto to do his own quick introduction. So with that, let's hand it over to Andy. We'll go around the Brady Bunch squares.
Hi. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Cockgreave, Senior Data Evangelist at Tableau and Salesforce. Currently on sabbatical, 1 more month to go. Looking forward to getting back to work. And great to be here. I'll pass you over to Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Wexler. I am the Chief Professional Chart Looker Adder at Data Revelations, along with Andy and Jeff, co-authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and author of The Big Picture. And with that, let me pass it on to Jeffrey.
Hello, everyone. Jeff Schaefer here from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm the Stern Professor of Practice at the University of Cincinnati, also the VP of IT and Analytics for a fintech company called Unifund, and with Steve and Andy, the co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards.
And over to you, Alberto. You want to say a few words about who you are for anyone who might be joining us and doesn't know you from your long history of data viz work?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm Alberto. I am a designer, a communicator, a journalist, an artist, tabletop gamer, heavy metal fan. I wear many, many hats. Consultant. I do many things. Writer of books. Yeah, I teach at the University of Miami. That's my main job as a professor.
One of many, many jobs and hats you wear. So we're excited to join everyone join us here today. As a reminder, today is not just chit chat, it is Chart Chat, where we dive into interesting topics and conversations all about data visualization. Today, we'll be chatting with Alberto about a couple really interesting topics. And throughout the conversation, we want to encourage you to join the debate. The roots of Chart Chat were back from when my co-hosts were writing the Big Book of Dashboards and the really interesting conversations they had as data visualization practitioners as they looked at different ways in which they thought about, saw, interpreted, created different data visualizations. And I think Alberto is a great person to have here today to talk a bit about those very nuanced decisions that we might make as designers. So we encourage you to join in on the YouTube chat. You're welcome to ask questions. You're welcome to pose questions to Alberto or just add your thoughts in the chat below. We'd love to pull some of your questions into the conversation too. It's one of the things we love about doing this session live. So today's topics, we'll cover three buckets like we oftentimes do in Chart Chat. First, we'll talk about books, about writing them, editing them, and why they matter in data viz. And we'll get a little preview from Alberto about the work that he's doing around his new book, The Art of Insight. Second, we'll talk about data viz rules, and I'll put that in quotes, and what it kind of means to design with goals beyond precision and efficiency. And we'll chat a bit about that in the big picture sense, borrowing from Steve's book title, and then also dive into the Washington Post broom chart, as I'm told it's been called. And last, we'll talk a little bit about awards in the field of data visualization. The folks who are here, our co-hosts, as well as Alberto, have participated in and been judges for different awards programs. And with the Return of the Information is Beautiful awards, there's been some really interesting conversations about the roles of awards in our field. And so those are our three primary big picture topics for today. So to go ahead and jump in and get started, let's talk a little bit about books. I am personally not a published author. I'm the only one on the screen who is not currently. But we have 4 published authors with us, including Alberto, who wrote his first 3 books and is currently working on The Art of Insight. And my co-hosts wrote the Big Book of Dashboards, and Steve also authored The Big Picture. And so there's lots of book knowledge on this panel today. And so what I'd love to do is pass it over to you, Alberto, to share a bit about what you're writing in The Art of Insight, and maybe give us an insight as to why, as you've shared publicly, this has been your favorite book to write so far.
Yeah, so far it's been a very pleasurable experience working on this new book. So my take about writing books is that writing a book is a way to give permanence to ideas and also to the work that we develop. And as you know, I mean, I don't just write books. I am also the co-editor of a series of visualization books for CRC Press, along with Tamara Mansner, who is also a book author and a scholar. And my goal in being an editor, honestly, is to try to persuade as many people as possible to write their own books. Among them, some of you, you should be working on your books already. I so far been able to persuade several, good friends and people whose work inspired me at the beginning of my career, like Jan Christensen from Scientific American. Her book is coming out next week. It's titled Building Science Infographics. I've been able to persuade Nigel Holmes. His book is also coming out next week. It's titled Joyful Infographics. And I'm trying to persuade many other people. The reason why I want people to write books is not that I want to overflow the market, right? It is that it gives work permanence. And not only that, it is a way also to show that behind the work that we do, there is actual people who think in different ways, people who reason in different ways, and the way that people reason about the work that we do can be valuable. The personal experiences that we all have permeate the work that we do. And I want to show that. Nigel has a particular way of doing infographics. Jen has a particular way of doing infographics. I want to learn from them because they are authors. We need, I think, in our profession to value authors and the different perspectives that authors provide. When working with them, for example, the main advice that I gave as a sort of like a, it's funny that I was going to use the word mentor when they actually mentor me when I was beginning my career, but I was sort of like mentoring them in the book writing process. Was essentially, you need to think that this is not, in the case of Jen, for example, her book about science graphics. I said, I think that you need to forget that you're writing the book about science infographics. You need to put yourself in the frame of mind that you are writing Jen Christensen's approach to making science infographics. That subjectivity is incredibly valuable. And the same thing I told Nigel. Nigel's book, Joyful Infographics, I joke that is the most Nigel Holmes book of all Nigel Holmes books. If you know the work of Nigel's, you will notice that when you read the book. And I stress that in every meeting that we had, just because I don't want to hear a voice from nowhere. I want to hear his voice talking about the work that he has done. Visualization as an extension of that, information design in general, the task of shaping information with different purposes, right, or for different purposes, is a craft. And in order to have a craft, you need to have the crafters, and every crafter has their own techniques and their own ways of thinking about things. So that's the way that I approach my own book writing, and it's also the way that I try to persuade other people to approach their own writing. And perhaps that is the reason why writing the Art of Insight is so pleasurable, simply because the book consists of a series of conversations with people. And I sprinkle my own comments here and there, but the essence of the book is just the conversation that I had with people like you, Amanda, and many others in the field. So it's sort of like a pleasure to hear from so many different ways of thinking about what we do and why we do it, and then put it all together into some sort of like cohesive package.
Alberto, this is fascinating, and as an author, I'm gonna ask you quite a challenging question. What about video and YouTube? Isn't it? Do we not get people's opinion, the people behind the work, and like animated delivery if we just deliver our content via video these days?
Yeah, but it doesn't have the same permanence, right? That's the challenge. So we don't know. With digital technologies, there are tons of challenges, as we all know, to preserve the work that is out there. Much of the work that I produced myself at the beginning of my career, between the 2000 and the 2005, when I was producing interactive visual explanations is gone. It cannot be viewed anymore. I can view it in my computer just because I still have the Flash player installed in my computer, so I can still show my own work, my old work, but it cannot be seen on the internet. And that is a challenge with digital technologies. There is something about books that give, again, the work permanence, that transform what it is sort of like a vague object that exists in a world in a virtual space into something physical. And that physicality, I think, has importance.
So here's an interesting question we actually have or a comment from Mark, is that it feels like impermanence is a feature, not a bug. I've tossed tech books that are a few years old because they're no longer relevant. What makes some of these kind of conversations and perspectives on data viz different? And I'd go back to my co-host and ask, I mean, 5 years later, we talked about the big book of dashboards. What would you do differently if you were to update it 5 years later? Does that feel sticky to you in terms of impermanence being a feature, not a bug?
I mean, I don't mind about that. There are certain types of books that don't need to be permanent. Any book that deals, for example, with how to use a particular software tool, obviously is going to be dated a couple of years from now. But, we are still talking about Florence Nightingale's work today, right? That will never go out of fashion. We are still talking about Charles Joseph Minard. We are still talking about, I mean, just think about the book series, Information Graphics Pioneers. I think that is the title of that book series, right?
Visionaries.
Visionaries, yeah, not pioneers, visionaries. There you go. That series of books. That series of books is incredible, right? That will never go out of fashion, and that is a way to give the work not only permanence but also more visibility. It is a testament to posterity that book exists, and that can exist in the libraries of people who care about this profession. And eventually, when we die, we can pass these books to other people who can take advantage. These books to other crafters who can take advantage of them.
Steve?
You are echoing a lot of what Seth Godin says about shipping work and about writing and producing. I would recommend to anyone who's coming into this, don't do it with the hopes that you're going to have a New York Times bestseller. That would be great. But instead, you have something unique to contribute. And there's probably a large enough audience that will greatly appreciate that unique thing that you're going to contribute. And you've impacted those people. That should be your goal. Hey, if you end up being a bestseller or actually making a lot of money from your book, bravo. But that's probably a more realistic way of looking at this, and you will greatly affect those people who read your book and your perspective on something.
I think that's a really great kind of point in terms of the ways in which we might impact small groups of people, not just big ones. Though, Alberto, admittedly, you have a pretty big audience at this point, and I know people may be curious about your process and how you approach book writing. Are you still willing to give us a preview of kind of how you've approached the art of insight before we bounce over to segment number 2 in our conversation today?
So the key to writing a book, I think, is to try to create a discipline for yourself. Like, don't wait until you are inspired to write, but actually force yourself to sit your ass down and start writing whatever it is, no matter how bad it is. You will have time to edit it later, right? The first draft of anything is going to be complete crap. Writing, like design, right? It's not just writing. The writing is a small part. You can write a book in a couple of months if you're serious about it. But the process of book writing takes usually a year or more, just because the editing is what really matters. The thing is to create some sort of discipline. Every author is a little bit different. Some authors are able to sort of like take out a couple of hours per day from their schedules and devote those 2 hours. In my case, I cannot do that. I am a one person, one activity per day. So I have my teaching and meetings days, my consulting, freelancing type of thing days, my research meeting days, and then I have my writing days, right? That doesn't mean that I spend 12 hours writing, but it means that the bulk of the work that I do that day, 4 or 5 hours, is devoted only to that activity. So I try to block 1 or 2 days per week just to work on the book. And then the process of writing is that I just write. I mean, I usually have sort of like a general plan in mind of what I want to say, like a list of bullet points that I want to make, but that changes down the road, because one feature about writing, which is also quite similar to the process of designing a visualization, is that writing is not just a way to communicate ideas. It's also a way to clarify ideas in your own brain. And in the process of writing, new ideas will pop out that you want to insert in the book. So it's sort of like assembling a puzzle that creates new pieces constantly, right? That's the way that I approach books. And then again, every writer writes in a different way. Some writers would like to write in word processors. I hate that because I like to see the book taking shape at the same time that I'm writing it. So the way that I do it, I'm actually going to show a few pages from the book. I already have like 1/4, more or less, drafted. This is the chapter about Jaime Serra, who is a popular infographics designer from Spain. And as you can see, I don't write in a word processor. I mean, I write it directly in InDesign, which is a design tool, a layout tool, just because I like to see where the images are going to be placed in the book. So the publisher will not use this file, by the way. What they will do will be to create something similar to this, but at least it gives the publisher an indication about font sizes, where images should be placed, right? What I envision for this part of that part. This is the chapter about Nadi Bremer. Nadi let me use many of her wonderful sketches. I wrote about also her recent data art, which, by the way, is on the cover of the book. The cover is that. I wrote about Shirley Wu. She's actually in the preamble, in the preface of the book. This is all obviously just the draft, right? This is going to be later copy edited, and this is a chapter about the warning stripes. All right, so yeah, I'm working on it at a good pace. I'm happy. I'm enjoying the process of doing it. I don't know. It's a pleasure to do this type of work, and it is also a privilege to be able to devote time to this type of work. This is one of my favorite chapters, by the way. This is a chapter about Pedro Cruz, who is a professor at Northeastern University, who created this beautiful visualization of U.S. immigration shaping immigration as if they were the rings inside of a tree. He uses these beautiful natural metaphors to represent data. And the point that I make over here is that I find that way of thinking about visualization really intriguing, because we sometimes represent realities from the natural world, such as migration, it's people coming into the country, in very unnatural ways, right? Through geometry. And what he tries to do in his beautiful visualization work is try to bring some of that naturalness, if that is even a word, to the representation of the data related to natural phenomena or to human phenomena, right? Mm-hmm. So all these conversations have been absolutely fascinating, and I am extremely thankful to everybody who offered to share 1 hour, a couple of hours of their time with me to have these conversations. It was incredible.
Well, I look at all of those, and I look at all those beautiful people who I'm inspired by, and then I feel somewhat humbled that you did a conversation with me for this book. We're much more pragmatic than some of the stuff that was being showcased there, and maybe that's a good segue over into talking a little bit about kind of what the goal of visualization is and the wide range of different kind of things that we do or related to rules versus kind of reasons for doing things. And it was interesting because, Alberto, I was trying to find the slide you had shared a little while ago from your talk at I/O and found some other clips about the rules of data visualization dating back a while in terms of people's interest in talking to you about rules of data viz and how some of these headlines evolved a bit from the rules of data viz, get an update from this Nat Geo article from more than 5 years ago to this idea about rules or reasons not rules in terms of how we think about visualization. That kind of brought me to what I had been looking for, which was about some of your points about this kind of pragmatic shift about the ways in which we make decisions in terms of making justifiable ethically and functionally choices according to certain goals and within various constraints. And so I'd love to hand it over to Jeff. Jeff, do you want to share a bit? When we were talking and kind of talking about what we'd love to chat with Alberto about, one of the topics that came up amongst us, if you can't believe it, we do spend some time prepping for these episodes, was around some of the interesting evolution and thinking around the different ways in which there are rules versus reasons for doing things. And for a group of folks here, the four of us who do a lot of very pragmatic visualizations, how do we think differently about how we assess what a good visualization is? So, Jeff, do you want to go and pull up your screen? Hand it off to you?
Absolutely, I will sure do that. Let me just get it in presentation mode. This might be the longest setup for 3 questions, but it'll be sort of your choose your own adventure, because I was not at our preview practice session for Chart Chat. So Alberto has not seen any of these slides, has not seen any of these questions, but knowing him as well as I do, I'm sure he will have insights into these in the end. When we were writing the big book of dashboards, the 3 of us kind of came around this idea, a common goal, if you will, for our audience, that for the largest number of people, we were providing the greatest degree of understanding with the least amount of effort. And I always found it easy to wrap my head around that, because when I teach at the business college, right? The University of Cincinnati, it's the business college. My students go out in the world making dashboards and charts for business. And so that's really easy to get around. And so when I go back to the fundamental research that we all, talk about and cite with, Cleveland and McGill, we think about these things, and we think about precision, we think about accuracy and time that it takes, and we rank these pre-attentive attributes. And in fact, by the way, one of my favorites is, of course, Alberto's version of this, because he has this exact same thing. He kind of reimagined it, if you will, in a really great way in your first book, right? The Functional Art. I want to take that further, I guess, in a broader sense. There's certainly visualizations that aren't made for that purpose, right? The purpose of the viz is not precision, accuracy, or speed to insight necessarily. And so to wrap my head around that, we've always talked, at least in our workshops, we think about who is the audience who's the intended audience that is supposed to read this visualization? What's the message you're trying to get across? And then I guess in the last few years, I've been talking about the medium in which it's produced, right? Is it static? Is it interactive? Is it mobile? Is it a big one? Is it a small one? And that helps me wrap my mind around something like this, which you mentioned, Menard. Is it the best statistical graph ever done, right? We had Seth Godin on a few months back, and Seth said, no, his words were no, it's not. It's one of the worst graphics ever done, which then always brings back one of my favorite charts by Jorge, who happens to be on here on our chart chat. He's listening along, so welcome. We don't have Menard with us today, but that we couldn't get him. But anyway, this is a different version of that, right? And so you ask yourself, is one better than the other? Edward Tufte certainly would prefer to have this, and it is framed and it's on my wall. Jorge would probably be better for Seth, and probably what he's thinking of in a boardroom where we just say, yep, they all died, the war's over, right? We don't need to know anything else. So that to me brings us to these categories. Andy Kirk does an amazing job of kind of describing these categories of, explanatory, exploratory, exhibitory. And we sort of have these categories that maybe things could live in. And we think about maybe explanatory as in something like Cole's book for storytelling with data. It's a very heavy annotated text, heavy chart. We can think of a long form visualization that has paragraphs of text and really just tells a story. There's no interactivity whatsoever to the visualization. And then we have something that might be exploratory, that could be a dashboard that you're going to filter by day, filter by state, filter by complaint type. You're going to dive in and try to figure out what's going on in your business, to something that might be a full interactive experience where you are going to make it personal. Somebody's going to click on their neighborhood to see the crime. They're going to look at the time of day to see their crime. They're going to go down and maybe select points on the map and interact with points on the map to see what time of day they are. And in fact, this particular one, I built this 10 years ago with some data from our city. You click on it and it drills in to see exactly where this point is on a map. And, with the advent of Google Street View, you can dive into so much detail on a viz and get lost in it, right? And so that brings me to maybe Georgia Lupi's famous viz, where she says she creates these multi-level storytelling visualizations that is like interactivity on paper. And so we've all seen this. I think it won medals at the Information is Beautiful Award. So we're going to talk about that later in the episode. But you can look at it by the type of award. You can dive into details about men versus women, or look at their degrees, or look at the schools they come from, or you can look at the cities that they come from, and so on. You have all these beautiful annotations on this chart that you can dive into. And yet, is it the best way to look at the data? Well, I love it. It's one of my favorite visualizations. But Steve Wexler, my co-author here, he reimagined that. And ask yourself, which one answers questions faster? Well, how many men are there? How many women are there? Well, we have that instantly that we don't have from George's viz, right? And so I think to myself, well, it kind of depends on who's that audience, right? What are they supposed to get out of it? And then I see a lot of things, even the example you just showed, Alberto, from your book, that strikes me as something that is often in data art, right? Where you aren't supposed to get that insight quickly or accurately. There's something else that you're supposed to take away from it. So in all of that, I had a couple here to set up for you. My main question to you, Alberto, is if we are thinking about the rules, and if the rules aren't based on accuracy and precision, then what are we basing those rules on? When we look at this chart redesign that you did, and I realize you did this quickly as an example, what makes that, right? How do we grade, or how do we assess? How do we decide if something's successful or not successful? What makes the one on the left not successful? How would we critique it? How would we improve it in a world where you're not using, accuracy, precision, or things like that? And of course, I'm saying they probably shouldn't all be measured that way. For our book, we came down to some things where, these are guidelines to help you, right? Design your visualization to a grid and avoid too much color and use color consistently. And, we talk about the font and so on. But I want to put it to you, and this is sort of your choose your own adventure, Alberto, so you can pick whatever you want to talk about here. My question is, do we abandon the data viz rules? And if we do, then what is the framework to measure the effectiveness of all these visualizations? Is the measure that we're going to use, is it different for those types of visualizations? Should we have a different measure for a business dashboard that is time and accuracy versus data art? And then we talk about design decision. That would be the third question. If we simply say, it was a design decision to put time on the y-axis, or to have 12 stacks on a bar chart, or to use a pie chart with 100 slices, at some point, right, it's like, okay, well, I get it. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but does that go to sort of a laissez-faire field where we are saying, is effectiveness in the eye of the beholder? So that was a lot to throw at you, Alberto, but I wanted to put real world context to some of these questions for the audience.
Yes,
No, and
welcome, Alberto, to Between the Two Ferns.
Between the two what? Sorry?
Between the Two Ferns.
It's a lot of questions, obviously, and it's a lot of topics to touch upon. So let me backtrack a little bit. I took notes of some of the things that you said, so I can comment on them. I will go back to them later. Now, the reason why I started talking more about reasons and justification rather than about rules is not that I find rules useless. Right? Rules, so to speak, right, which are essentially heuristics. They're not really rules or laws, right? They're more heuristics and conventions that we use. They are useful because they are shortcuts. They are shortcuts that you can explain to people, right? Usually it's better to do this rather than this. Usually, if you want to compare things, it is better to use a bar graph rather than a pie chart. And you teach that, right? But that is not a reason, right? It's just a rule. So throughout the years, I have come to believe that it is much more productive to explain to people where all those things come from and what the exceptions are and when they should be applied, when they should not be applied. And that's a reason. There is a reason why a bar graph is usually better than a pie chart when the purpose of the graphic is comparisons. And here are the reasons why, right? We have some empirical evidence that is tentative, that may change in the future, right? But we have a reason to act this way and not in a completely different way. Do you want to call that a rule? I don't care. I don't like to talk about rules. And the reason why I don't like to talk about rules is that I tend to equate or to make analogies between visualization and writing. And to me, there are no rules in writing. It's like talking about rules in writing is silly. I mean, there's a grammar, there is a syntax, but within the boundaries of that grammar and that syntax that is constantly evolving, the decisions that you make when you write are highly subjective. But being subjective doesn't mean that all decisions are the same. Some of them will be more justifiable or less justifiable, better reason or worse reason, right? I am doing this because, and then that's the type of thinking that I try to instill in my own students, just to show them that the process of designing a visualization is not simply that you get the data and then you get sort of like a worksheet that tells you where to go, right? From here to here, then you go here. It's like choose your own adventure. It doesn't work that way, right? Doesn't work that way. Now, many of the decisions that we make, again, are highly subjective, but that doesn't mean that they are all equal. Again, that's super important because wrongly, many people believe that subjectivity implies that truth doesn't exist or something like that. I mean, truth with a capital T doesn't exist, but truth with a lowercase t does exist, and we can approximate those truths in different ways if we apply that type of reasoning, right? Now, everything that I'm saying and all everything that you mentioned, you show that pragmatic shift type of thing that I'm trying to advocate for, etc. That is not new. That is in the environment, right? That's not something that I made up with. We all work that way already, right? People who work in visualization for a living, we already know that those laws are ideals, platonic ideals out there that may be useful sort of like as very vague guiding lights, right? Always represent your data. Well, sure, but how should I do that, right? How do I get there? And that is the reasoning part, right? That is the pragmatic shift. Also, it's part of the pragmatic shift, which again is not something I have invented. It's something that again is in the environment because that's experience that we all go through. So I don't like to talk about rules. I don't like to talk about categories. For example, I don't think that those categories that you show that Andy put out in his book, that I'm going to perhaps mention, by the way, in the new book, exploratory, explanatory. I use a different term. I don't like exhibitory. I don't remember what the term was, but I'm using a different. I'll probably use a different term. Those are not categories. Those are not types of graphics. Those can be aims, purposes, features of a graphic, right? Some graphics are both explanatory and exploratory. Some graphics are exploratory, explanatory, and artistic, and that's a great way. It's a matter of emphasis. What do you emphasize the most in your visualization? As to what to base rules on, I don't care. I don't care what we base things on, other than caring about the people who are going to read our graphics. And this leads me to a quick thought about your point about accuracy, precision in the representation of the data, right? Historically, and for good reasons, people who wrote about visualization put a lot of emphasis on the accuracy of the representation, right? And also on the precision of the ways that we represent. Accuracy relates to the, let's say, truthfulness of the numbers and the information that we are using. And precision is a measure of how well the visualization, the representation of the data matches, geometrically speaking, the representation of the numbers that we are representing, right? We care a lot about that from the point of view of the designer. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But the pragmatic shift also involves that caring about the accuracy and the precision of the visualization is just an instrumental value. That is not the core value. The core value is to inform somebody. So we should not care that much about the accuracy or the precision of the representation. We need to care much more about the accuracy and the precision of the perception of that representation. And that is where the testing part in visualization comes in. Also, in the matching between purposes and results. It's like, if a designer has a certain purpose, a certain set of purposes in mind, I want people to be able to explore these, to compare these, to do these, to navigate these, to reach the conclusions to these questions, blah, blah. You make sort of like a list of possible tasks that you want to enable. Then you can test that against the results, right? That's essentially user testing. Again, nothing particularly novel, nothing particularly groundbreaking, But it's a shift in the way that we think about visualization. In many ways, visualization has fallen behind many other fields, UX and human computing interaction, for example, right? The way that we, not visualization per se, but the way that we talk about visualization, the discourses that we use when we talk about visualization. We talk about visualization too often from a very idealistic perspective, right? We invent ideals of precision, laws of representation, and whatever, and we measure any graphic against of how well it approximates those ideal laws. Well, I'm not an idealist. I am a pragmatist, and pragmatists measure things this way. It's like, how well does it work? We obviously care also about the intended purpose of the designer, because we could say, well, but what about if a designer designs a graphic with the purpose of misleading someone, and the graphic is extremely successful as misleading someone? Is that a good graphic? Well, from the point of view of consequentialist thinking, sure, it's a good graphic, but we can apply a little bit of deontology and to say, no, it's not a good graphic because it's contaminated from the get-go. The intent of the designer is bad, right? From the very beginning. I mean, this is not just the thoughts that came to my mind. We could go on and on and on. But this is just
by the way, this is a special 3-hour chart chat today. So
yeah,
please.
sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, it all makes me think a lot, Alberto, actually to Crystal Lee's research that she did with her team around the use of data visualization to spread anti-mask sentiment and to reinforce those points. And one of the recommendations that came out, that because there are some very practical recommendations in their paper, was around needing to give more visibility to who the creators are of the visualizations, because it engenders more trust of the things that actually are correct and accurate and representing complex scientific information. So like you could go down a rabbit hole your side. I could go down a rabbit hole of misinformation and the pandemic. But Andy has something to chime in on, I think.
Yeah, I purpose and result, you said there, Alberto. Actually, I'm going to share my screen because this is something I've been thinking about a lot as well. If you've been seeing my social media posts recently, you may have been seeing, I'm trying to look at, there are two reasons I wanted to show this, because you said explore, explain, and you said purpose and result, right? I've been thinking about what are the levers we can push and pull when we create visualizations as a way to then make visualizations with intent and also assess what the designer was trying to do and what their purpose was and assess their success. So the top one of these, well, both of these pieces show air quality for a week in Sheffield, which is a city in the north in UK. This is Necklace by Miriam Quick and Stephanie Posovich. This is the evening of November the 5th, which is when we blow up fireworks and do bonfires across cities across England. So you can see a physical representation of a bad week of data, and this is a more random week done in a bar chart. Both fantastic. Now, lever-wise, I'm not sure what the right levers are yet. Slow, fast, dry, emotional, accurate, ambiguous, sparse, granular, honest, dishonest. I did have explore and explain in here, but removed them because, as Alberto says, any chart can be explored or explained depending on what you're doing. The reason I wanted to show you this is because, Alberto, you said purpose and result, and this really resonates here. I was digging through some old emails, an email exchange with Stephen Few about the necklace, and he said anybody in their right mind wouldn't make a necklace to represent data. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But when you speak to Miriam and Stephanie about their purpose of this exhibition where these necklaces were shown was to engage people who don't engage with data. And it's like, if you showed people who don't care about data a bar chart, would they care as much as them physically wearing a heavy necklace and seeing that data represented there? So I think, Jeff, you talking about success, and Alberto, you talking about purpose and intent. That is a really strong example where the intent of the designer and the type of audience creates a framework for a radically different chart than the bar chart would.
I would say, by the way, talking about these sort of like pairs of terms, that there are many of them that are actually not opposed to each other. For example, accurate and ambiguous. Something can be accurate and ambiguous. The representation of something can be accurate, but it can be perceived as ambiguous. That is that duality between the what we intend to do and what it's actually perceived, right? It will be perceived as ambiguous. How would do we reduce that ambiguity? Well, we need to test it, redesign it, show it again, then go back and see what people get from the graphic, right? Dry and emotional. Well, the second graphic can be emotional to many people depending on the type of data that is being represented, right? If I see a sudden spike in sort of like low air quality or whatever, I may be emotionally impacted by the second graphic, even if that is not the intention of the designer. The intention of the designer was going to be completely neutral. So again, all ways of talking about visualization used to put a lot of emphasis on the designer side, on the data side, on the accuracy of the representation. But I think that the emphasis should be put on the other side. Again, this is not anything particularly new. If we go back to Tufte's very first book, he addresses these. He says, there are certain types of your representations that are geometrically accurate, right? If you represent data through bubbles, for example, and you use area to represent the data geometrically well, right, accurately, right, you are doing it correctly in an ideal manner, but then it will be perceived wrongly, right? Just because people tend to minimize those differences when we see those bubbles, right? So again, it's not anything new, and it is not a dual thing. The way that I talk about visualization is not necessarily opposed to the way that people have traditionally talked about visualization, but it is a matter of emphasis. To me, the accuracy of the representation, being truthful to the numbers, doing good analysis, trying to be as accurate as possible, blah, 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 all those are instrumental goals. The final goal is that people actually get what they need. That's the ultimate goal of the ultimate value that we need to care about. And that is the reason why I said that this is a pragmatic shift, because in order to get there, there may be, there are reason paths that we can take. There is not a single path. Usually there are many different paths. And in order to get there, we will not get there simply by applying idealistic rules that exist in the cloud. I mean, we apply by trying, doing, making, changing, testing, going back to the drawing board. And again, nothing particularly new. We all know that, right? All that I'm saying is verbalize something that people are already doing in the real world. But that we do in the real world needs to be translated or needs to be reflected in the way that we talk about visualization. That is the reason why I want to stop talking about rules, because that is not the way that we talk about visualization when we talk about ourselves, right?
That's true, Steve. I think you might have a counterpoint.
And then, well, just you use the term pragmatism, which I like. Yet I'm seeing such a celebration of what I would consider very impractical charts. To an extent, I think in the data visualization world, we live in a bubble because there are so many people who are frightened by, don't rely on charts to help them understand the world. We want to change that. And then I don't know if we're going to have time for the Information is Beautiful awards, but I see that as a bubble within a bubble. Mm-hmm. But the maybe, Amanda, I'll defer to you. Maybe this is a good time to transition to the Washington Post.
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Before we do that, by the way, and perhaps listeners will need a little bit of context to these. But I also said that my approach to visualization is not only pragmatic, but it's also hedonistic. And you replied to me in social media saying, but hedonism is all about pleasure, right? I said, yes, sure. But, there's much more than that to it, right? The way that we use all these terms, pragmatic has a certain sense in common language, but it has a much more precise meaning or a much richer meaning in the philosophical tradition, in the pragmatist tradition of philosophy. And the same thing happens to hedonism, right? A hedonist is not someone who spends their entire lives like eating a lot, drinking a lot, and whatever, right? Having sort of like what traditional Greek philosophers would call low pleasure. So there is nothing low about them. A hedonist is simply someone who believes that the ultimate goal of what we do is to try to benefit people's lives and to try to improve to the extent of our capacity, our own well-being, our own state of pleasure, which essentially means well-being in the tradition. It's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So these terms can be, again, ambiguous in the way that we use it if we don't explain them clearly. There's a whole section in the book that will probably be titled Hedonism or Pragmatism, and I may explain a little bit about the way that type of thinking also shapes the way that I think about visualization and what the instrumental goals of visualization are and the ultimate goals of visualization truly are.
Well,
I think that they should. Again, this is a very personal approach. It's just my approach, right? There are many other ways of thinking about visualization because I'm also a pluralist. Yeah.
I think it's good to kind of flag that it's just, I think, important for leaders in this space to be talking about the ways that we think and do and practice data visualization. And even those of us who do very pragmatic things, like I see my pragmatism and my data viz mindset spilling over into putting my kid in a pizza box every single month to take baby pictures to make a little pizza pie chart. So, I mean, we pull those kind of threads of data visualization into our lives in different ways. I know we wanted to go ahead and dig into a specific example, maybe, of something that doesn't sit over in the data art space entirely, but in something that kind of breaks rules. And in talking about this section today, a while ago, back in May, Nick Desbaratz, who is a great writer who does work on practical reporting by the same name, looked for examples of good use cases for vertical line charts and got some interesting responses and examples from different folks who said, here's some examples of good vertical line charts. You can explore some of these on the Nightingale article he wrote about what he heard and saw. And one of the only examples that came up that he said he really liked was this one that talked about Republicans have moved further to the right, the Democrats have to the left. And it provides this vertical view in terms of how we're looking at a line and how we're looking at the Congresses. So you're seeing Congresses moving forward chronologically from top to bottom instead of from left to right. And it was interesting that this popped up to me because they played around with a couple different ways of visualizing the same data. And when we started having a conversation this past week about this broom chart, this chart from the Washington Post that looked at follower numbers in terms of fewer followers or more followers in a raw number count across different Democratic and Republican Congress people. When we looked at that, you could see the biggest shifts in Twitter followers for Republican and Democratic members of Congress since Elon Musk's purchases of Twitter happened, and they're labeled as such at the ends of these lines. And so as we look at these kind of charts, there was a lot of debate in the data viz space around why is this vertical? Like, why couldn't this be done horizontally so it's more chronological in nature? If you turn it to the side, it looks kind of like this and kind of explodes out. And there was a lot of interesting debate. Steve, I know you had pulled up an example that showed that maybe they didn't decide at the Washington Post to do it just one way, that gives some options in terms of what that looks like. But do you want to go ahead and pull that up and talk a bit about some of your thoughts about this chart and how it was just designed and displayed?
Well, here is the article as it appeared in the Washington Post. And I was one of those people who had a problem with it, but not because it violated a rule. I've got to say, Alberto, when you wrote that wonderful blog post about it, I kind of bristled with this. And if, I guess to an extent, if you were like the Walter Cronkite of data visualization, I'm sort of the Andy Rooney of data visualization on this thing. But it wasn't because it broke a rule. It was, gee, I had to take a long time to parse this thing and understand what it was about. And then I didn't even see, the brilliant insight in this thing, or the cleverness of this, which is, things are going to the right, winners are going to the right, losers are going to the left in terms of these things. It just took a lot of time for me to see, there was a certain point, and now certain representatives in that are red, Republican picked up Twitter followers, and then some representatives that are blue lost followers, with the exception of Hakeem Jeffries, who's now the minority leader in the House of Representatives. Now, what I didn't note until Alan Smith of the Financial Times chimed in on this discussion is, if you view this on a mobile device, which I'm going to emulate at the moment, there we go. And the thing that took me 20 seconds to parse, and that a lot of people that I know who are reasonably informed, my gym buddies who read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, never would have bothered with that other chart. They would have gone, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to skip this. They would have immediately grokked this and seen, oh, I get this. Here are these Republicans that are gaining all these followers, and here are these Democrats that are losing all these followers. There's another issue I have with this as well, with the presentation of it. Jeff, I don't mean to steal your thunder on this, but you looked at Senator Elizabeth Warren losing that many followers. She lost fewer than 2% of her followers. As for Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, I believe she was reinstated on Twitter in the middle of November. That may explain that big jump that was there. But I'm wondering, was it worth all the effort to be put together the, hey, look how it's almost, are you helping your audience see something, or are you trying to show, how clever you are, and that, hey, I'm going to change this thing so I can show, look at these things moving to the right, which I stupidly didn't even see that. It just took a while for me to see red going to the right, red gaining, blue losing, which I got instantly when it was presented in a more traditional fashion.
So is this a good example of where to break some, I guess, data viz kind of rules as we might hear them described, or do a vertical line chart? Andy?
Oh, Steve, you see, all the way through that, I was like, I'm just going to disagree with Steve because, break the rules. It looks cool. It stops you. And I wrote down the question. Well, Steve said you took a long time to pass it. And you know what? If you take a long time to pass a chart, sometimes that's a good thing because you have to dive
and
in.
90% of people didn't even bother to look at it, Andy.
No, so Steve, and then you started making the window narrower and narrower. It rotated the other way, and I went, oh yeah, it's just so much quicker when it's a regular line chart. I'm like, so I scribbled my question in. Yeah. So I think I'm having seen you do that thing narrowing the window. I'm like, I don't know why they did this.
Jeff, Team Jeff, good example of breaking the rules or not?
I didn't particularly like it for two reasons. One, sometimes when people do these charts left and right, you're going more in both directions. So like if you look at, is the Supreme Court, the justices leaning more left or leaning more right, the further you go to the right side, it's more red. The further you go to the left side, it's more blue. So there's a lot of charts out there that kind of go left and right in that sense. And that's not what's happening here, right? They just made the decision that, the red and blue, dividing. I agree with Steve and Andy. I think just flipping that chart makes it so much easier to say, oh, going up is more followers, going down is less followers. And I was the one I pointed out to Steve, I think it was, is like, well, I don't know about the underlying data. How do we choose these folks? Are they really the top followers on Twitter? They certainly don't all have the same range of followers. So then you have somebody who has 100,000 followers jumping up versus Elizabeth Warren, who has millions and tens of millions of followers. It's going down. Is it an apples to apples comparison? So fundamentally, I like this view better, but still the underlying data concern me as well.
Well, and we got a couple of great comments here from folks. I like when the shape of a chart is evocative of something else that is relevant to the topic at hand. In this case, reminded of lightning striking as an example. And that kind of comes back to this example that was pulled up as a good vertical line chart of kind of moving left or moving right position-wise for some folks. Alberto, I'd love to give you the final word on this broom chart.
Yeah,
you wrote about this chart.
Yeah. Full disclosure, and I disclose that in what I wrote because it's important for context. I am biased in favor of any work produced by former students of mine, and this was produced for former student of mine. So I feel I feel personal about it. But the way that I think that I addressed this in my talk at I/O. The older I get, the less opinionated I become. And which might be sort of like completely opposite to what happens to most people. I don't know, but the older I get, the less I care. It's like, I'm going to try to sort of like a caveat that. So instead of thinking, why should I do this? I think more, why not? Why not try something new? Why not try something different? Particularly in a case when we are publishing a graphic, not with the purpose of being fully analytical. This is not in a research paper. This is published in a newspaper. So sometimes novelty, surprise are things that designers weigh. When we weigh all the possible aims that a graphic may have, accuracy, precision in the perception of a graphic obviously is super important, but sometimes surprise, playfulness, joy in the presentation of the graphic are also weighted in the decisions that we make. It is also easy, and I'm completely to blame for that type of sin, right? Particularly in the past, of criticizing something in hindsight, right? After it has been published, it's super easy to criticize something in the abstract. Maybe I would have tried this myself. I don't know if I were in a similar situation. Perhaps I wanted to do something a little bit more playful, sacrificing a little bit of the clarity of the graphic in order to gain sort of like attractiveness and novelty, etc. I think that the graphic is perfectly fine. I didn't have any problem reading it just because I took a quick look at the scales, and my experience of reading the graphic was fun, and I liked it. And I didn't know, by the way, when I was reading the graphic, that it was designed by a former student of mine, Luis Melgar. I knew that later, right? But at the same time, right, I am not the one to judge a graphic that way, just because, the ultimate measure of the quality of a graphic is whether people get something interesting from it, whether they look at it in the first place, whether they enjoy reading it, whether they learn something useful. And in hindsight, if we discover that most people who read this graphic are like Steve and his friends from the gym, then they are like me, that gives the designer a good reason to be careful next time that we break a convention, such as putting time on the horizontal axis rather than on the vertical axis, right? That's a convention. It's a traditional convention. It has some grounding in perception, perhaps. There is some discussion about time on horizontal axis in books such as Mind in Motion, etc., that we read time more naturally horizontally, but there's many cases in which putting time on the vertical axis makes sense, either because it better represents the data, it changes the emphasis, right? In the examples that you provided, the emphasis, the ones showing the moving to the left and moving to the right of the Republican and the Democratic Party, the emphasis there is no time. The emphasis there is the shift. And that is the reason why the shift is put on the horizontal axis, and time, that is secondary, is put on the vertical axis, right? It's also a matter of emphasis. Everything that I'm describing, novelty, attractiveness, accuracy, conventions, etc., all those are factors that we designers weigh every day. And sometimes we need to sacrifice a little bit of that. Sometimes the graphic will not work, but that's fine. It doesn't hurt anybody, right? It's like, if you read the graphic, you ultimately understand what the graphic is trying to convey. Does it take you 20 seconds longer? Well, sure, okay. That may be a reason to try to do something different next time, but it is not the end of the world, right? So that's essentially my judgment about that graphic. It's like, why not?
Well, I mean, I think we could go ahead, as suggested previously, do a 3-hour chart chat with the four of us and you, Alberto. As much as Galen has said that he's here for that, and for a 3-hour chart chat popping up at some point, we do have to wrap up, and we will pause and go ahead and punt, I think, our conversation about the awards to the after party, which we'll talk about just now. So to wrap up today, we want to make sure that you know that there is another great chart chat coming in 2023. Lots of great chart chats. We're going to be having Stephanie Werner and Steve Francaneri joining us, two researchers who actually look at and research about the various different ways in which we understand and see data visualizations, and talk about the evidence there. So excited to have some researchers joining us for Chart Chat in January to kick off the year. It was weird typing 2023 onto the new slides already. I'm sure we'll make a couple mistakes going forward. Andy, you've got a class coming up.
I do, yeah, in January, communicating and persuading with data. I haven't got a URL on here. I wonder if I can get one before in the comments before we sign off, but ping me details on social media to find out more.
Or there's been lots of chatter about it, sharing it on the DVS Slack. Come check it out there. Yeah. Big Book of Dashboards website, workshops, recordings, resources is always available, including a dedicated page for Chart Chat. And Steve, you've got workshops coming up.
Yes, I do. There should be another slide with the URL on it, but a dashboard. Thank you. There you go. BigPig.me, January 2023 for dashboard design workshop. And I put into the chat the URL if you want to sign up for the next chart chat. We'd love to have you there.
Wonderful. And I'll put in a quick plug to join and hang out with us over in the Data Visualization Society if you haven't already. We had a great effort around kind of sparking more conversations in Slack last week. Thanks, Steve. And are really excited about some of the programming coming down the pike in 2023, including Outlier. Outlier is back. We're very excited about it. So our big conference is back, and Nightingale Print Issue 2 is printed and starting to ship. So we do have our Print Issue 2 out there. The cover has a juice box on it. If you want to know why, go check out nightingaledvs.com and learn more about Nightingale in print. And with that, we'll go ahead and we're going to sign off for the day. Before we do that, one of my co-hosts, I hope, can go ahead and plug the URL into the chat box. We always welcome folks to join us for the after party, which is where you can hop into a Zoom room and have a conversation where you can be part of the conversation, not just in the chats on YouTube. And Alberto will be joining us for the after party to keep the conversation going. And maybe we can tackle the tricky topic of awards and data visualization awards there. So do join us if you have the time and are interested in continuing the conversation over in the after party. Alberto, it's been such a pleasure to have you here today and to have a chance to go ahead and hear some of your perspectives and get woefully intimidated by the idea of actually laying out a book in InDesign. I think using slide docs is the closest I get to that level of design excellence. So I'm excited to see the behind the scenes and have a chance to chat with everybody. There's the sign up link for 2020 for the next chart chat and for the chart chat 36 after party. With that, we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up and we'll sign off from the live stream. Andy, Jeff, Alberto, and Steve has already opened up that Zoom room. It was great to see all of you. And with that, we'll sign off for the day. I hope everyone has a wonderful end of the year. Have a happy holidays, however you're celebrating. And I hope everyone gets some offline time, to maybe do some physical data visualizations with Play-Doh, things like that don't involve a screen.
Thank you.
All right.
everyone.
After party.
Take care, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.